and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and our special guests for today's episode are...
I'm Dr. Rob Citino, the senior historian here at the museum and the executive director of the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy.
Kaylee Martin, historian here at the National World War II Museum.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
And Kristen Burton, teacher, programs, and curriculum specialist here at the museum.
Hello.
Today, we'll be talking about the 2004 film Downfall, or Der Untergang, as it was released in Germany. Downfall focuses on the events inside Hitler's Führerbunker in Berlin in 1945 during the last days of the Third Reich. Film shows the human side and the personal stories buried within the madness that was the downfall of the supposed 1,000-year Reich. Downfall draws heavily on personal accounts written in post-war books by witnesses to the events such as Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, and Rokus Misch, an SS telephone operator and radioman inside the bunker. Downfall stars Bruno Ganz as Adolf Hitler, Alexandra Maria Lara as Traudl Junge, Ulrich Mathis as Joseph Goebbels, Julian Kohler as Eva Braun, Thomas Kretschmann in every German role in World War II movies, Christian Berkel, and many, many more. Film was directed by Oliver Hirschbiegel, written by Bernd Eichinger, based on Traudl Junge's book Until the Final Hour, and Inside Hitler's Bunker by Joachim Fest. Downfall received mixed but mostly positive reviews upon release. So with that, Rob, I'll start with you. In your opinion, how accurate is Downfall?
In terms of a war movie, action, uniforms, sort of feel for street combat, I thought this film was extremely accurate. We're fortunate to have almost a complete record of everything everybody said in the bunker. So the conversations that you're hearing, you probably, if you're into this field at all, you've read these conversations many, many times. So I don't know. I liked it. Seth, I've seen a lot of movies that purport to be about urban combat. I thought this one really kind of got it right. Buildings exploding out of nowhere, whole families trying to get away, little kids desperate to reach their parents, and vice versa. I mean, it was terrifying in part, and I think that's probably the most accurate part of it.
Kaylee?
I agree. It's pretty accurate. I think there's some of the places where it's not is maybe because there's differing opinions on how things happen. There's a lot of little events in the film that, depending on whose account you read, it happens in a different manner, especially when, I know we'll talk about it later, but the Goebbels kids, that story has several different iterations. But yeah, overall, I agree. The combat, the fanaticism, that just deep fanaticism that you see even out of young children, it's pretty good.
Kristen?
I have to agree with you both. I think, Callie, you hit on a lot of the things I made notes of myself. Just the fact that you're going through the end of the war in Berlin. Aesthetically, it looks like the photographs you see of Berlin at the end of the war. I think they really nailed the overall look of the bunker as well. But the thing that stood out to me was the fanaticism of the people who were behind Hitler, the Hitler Youth, who were loyal to the very end. As horrifying as it was, those are the things that stood out to me as making it seem particularly accurate.
Kristen, let's give Bruno a shout out. Adolf Hitler. That's a tough role to play.
Yes.
I mean, it's scenery chewing. It's just the most scenery chewing role you can possibly think of, and I think for Bruno Ganz, right? Is it Ganz? For Bruno Ganz to bring some kind of humanity to the role. This is the thing people talked about, whether you like it or you didn't like it. If Hitler's not a human being, then I don't know what we're doing as historians. We should be theologians or discussing demons or something of that nature. But I thought, he did bring some, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes here, folks, no one can see it. He did bring some humanity to the role, which is a difficult thing to do in that role. We've seen a lot of people playing Hitler already.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's one of the best portrayals, I think, that is out there because so many of them are comical. And it's satire, it's parodied, but this one is real, and it's it's very real.
Who's going to mention memes first?
I mean, well, come on.
We're going to get to that. Let's keep it let's keep it historical if we can.
I will say though, it's an interesting point, and I do want to get into that because I think it's probably what this movie's best known for is that one scene. But the portrayal and the acting in general, I thought was fantastic across the board. Of course, Bruno Ganz, and I was reading an article where he was talking about his reaction when he was approached. So the actor's Swiss. He's not German, but he was completely horrified when they approached him to play this role. He didn't want to do it, and he said the thing that convinced him to change and changed his mind was someone obtained audio of Hitler speaking in a private conversation where he's not, being his usual demagoguery self, and it was the more mellow tenor of his voice and that look into the human side of Hitler that changed his mind and ultimately led him to take on the role.
Yeah, I think, like you said, Kaylee, most of the depictions of Hitler that you see are frankly, they're wildly inaccurate. They either make him out to be a clown or they make him out to be a coward, which, there's arguments that he was both. But in on celluloid, if you will, he's not, I don't think he's portrayed very accurately, except for this movie. He was a human being. As nasty and as repugnant as he was a living, breathing human being.
I've spent most of my life sort of wading through the minutes of Führer conferences. He's talking to his staff or he's talking to his associates. That's what I spent my entire professional life doing. You can find bunker scenes in which, for example, he's talking to Jodl, his operations chief within the OKW. And it's a pretty sober summation of the situation at the front at the time. There's one in July where he's saying, we don't have an Air Force right now. So it's July 44. We don't have an Air Force right now, so there's really not much we can do. But once we build our Air Force back up, maybe we can undertake mobile operations again. You read it and you say, yeah, if you come across it, and people wouldn't say, well, this is Adolf Hitler. You would say, well, it's two staff officers having a conversation. When someone says, well, that is Adolf Hitler, you immediately picture him screaming the words at the top of his lungs, like he does in some of these scenes. It's well attested. Hitler was having something approaching a physical and mental breakdown by the time we get to these bunker scenes in the last 10 days. There's no doubt about that. But, this whole, look, I understand why people say Hitler was an idiot in World War II. It was part of the arsenal. It was part of the war. Cutting Hitler down to size was important for morale. But you have to, as historians, look after the fact. People were terrified of him in 1940. So no one in 1940 was saying, well, this guy's such a jerk. He's going to implode and everybody will be fine. It looked like an existential threat to humanity. So at the very least, I think he needs to be treated seriously. And I think that Gans does a good job of treating his character seriously.
I agree 100%. It shows, the movie shows a side that only people who would have been there saw of him. And as you said, all of us here sitting at this table were born and raised in the United States, so have been fed, for better or worse, the view of Hitler that was basically hasn't changed since we got into the war in 1941. Is that he was just this evil, blood dripping, horrible demon. Yeah. And again, I'm not saying the guy was a good guy by any means, right. But he was a guy. He was a human being, and he. People in Germany did, and outside did love him for a reason. He was a charismatic guy, and you see that in this movie too at some times.
Let's just remember who portrayed Hitler for us after the war. It was all his generals and all his minions and all those officials who survived the Third Reich, who had a vested interest in saying, well, look, I didn't know what I was doing. His blue eyes were hypnotic, and he looked at me and he made me do things I didn't want to do. I think we need to treat those memoirs and that evidence with the kind of seriousness it deserves, which is to say not that much.
Well, and Traudl Junge writes about it in her book, that he had this way that you could go in and you would be determined that you were going to say something and you had an opinion, and before you knew it, he had changed your opinion. So he had this charisma, this ability to just get into people's heads and make them buy into things that 10 minutes ago they wouldn't have agreed to.
It's called leadership. I mean, not in a good way.
No, but I
Not in a good way.
mean, people don't end up in those kind of positions of power by accident.
Yeah, that's right.
And as much as he was a human, and I'm glad to see a portrayal of Hitler that is has more depth than the usual one-dimensional portrayals of either buffoonery or pure evil. At the same time, his ideas were very dangerous and destructive, and because of the charisma, he was able to convince so many people to do the most atrocious things. And I found this interesting quote from the director, and I thought it summed up this film pretty well, because there was backlash against the way it humanized Hitler. And he said, quote, "Bad people do not walk around with claws like vicious monsters." And then he goes on to say, "Everyone intelligent knows that evil comes along with a smiling face."
Yeah, he loved his dog. He loved his dog.
Oh, yes, Blondie.
Loved his dog so much he killed him. Her.
Yeah.
At the end of the war.
Beautiful dog.
Yeah, Ava hated that dog, though. I didn't know that.
Well, I mean, it's actually true. She says that in the movie, or the actress says that in the movie, but that is true. She was not a fan of Blondie.
Yeah, I had
Probably because Blondie got more attention from Hitler than did Ava.
And he hated her dogs. She had 2 black schnauzers, and he hated them, and she hated his.
Amazing.
I think we hit the dog talk in here sooner or later. It's like it's an
Amazing.
obsession here at the museum. We all love our dogs. Those are scenes that really resonated with me in the film. By the way, since we're talking about Hitler and the portrayal there, I saw one weakness in the film. I don't think it was the actress. I think it was the role as it was written, because you can only do what's on the page. That portrayal of Ava Braun is just kind of super silly. It's kind of just. There's been some research on Ava Braun, like a biography written just a couple of years ago, a German historian. She was quite a more powerful figure in the Third Reich than you might think from the portrayal of this movie. Clearly, she spent more personal time with Hitler than anyone in the world. She was always at the Berghof. That's the big resort, the big resort that they had up in the mountains. She spent a lot of time with him. She undoubtedly had a lot of impact on his policy choices, on his personnel choices. Maybe by the end in the bunker, it was just slamming down the champagne and people were getting kind of wild, and so maybe that's what you're seeing reflected there. But I thought that was the Ava Braun that you would get in a history in the 1950s and the 1960s. It's not the Ava Braun you'd get in a history written more recently.
Right.
When she's seen as a more independent person.
And I think you're referencing to, is it the Ava Braun, A Life with Hitler?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's what Dr. Gortemacher.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I looked at that too because I was curious about the depiction.
2 points for Dr. Burton. Well done.
No, this is where I like. I've hit my limit. No, it's interesting because I remember watching the film wondering, is this who Ava Braun really is? Because honestly, she is a character who is peripheral to the story more often than not. And I didn't know much about her as a person. But when you sit down and think about it, she's someone who met Hitler when she was 17 years old in 1929 and stays with him until they die collectively, together. They get wed right before they take their own lives. But she's with him from age 17 to the end. And
to 33, which is the age she is when she dies, right?
Oh, that's good math,
right?
Dr. Satino. But from 29 to 45, she's with him that entire time. And Hitler was 40 when they met.
40 and 17.
40 and 17.
I think it's time for Dad to have a little talk with the suitor coming around to date my daughter.
That doesn't happen by accident, and I think she knew exactly what she was doing and found someone who he was in a position of power when they met. And that book lays out the argument that she wasn't the dumb blonde that many of Hitler's cronies present her as, and it's through those narratives we get this portrayal of her, but she was actually quite capricious and knew exactly what she was doing and made herself very wealthy by that connection.
But Hitler did, there are accounts that he said a few times that, a smart woman was dangerous. And he would kind of allude to the fact that she was a little vapid, he thought. And he didn't marry her because he had this idea that the German women saw him as this, almost sex symbol, I guess. They revered him.
It's obviously a moving target over the decades.
Were he to marry, all of this would go away. And one thing that I didn't realize is the German public didn't know who Ava Braun was. And if you read some of the books about what's happening there, she comes to Berlin to die with him. I think she knows this is going to happen. She's tried to commit suicide twice in her life already. So she's clearly an individual with some mental health issues. And I think that's why one reason she so easily buys into being willing to do this. But I don't know. She's an interesting character. I definitely think she is not given enough credit for what she did. But at the same time, she was kept pushed to the side. And you read that when a lot of these officials would come, Hitler would shove her out of the room and she had to stay hidden. So, and she's considered to be kind of a sad, lonely character by some. So she's a very complex individual.
She is interesting. And one thing in reading this book that Dr. Gortemacher, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but one thing she lays out is Braun's participation in cultivating the image of Hitler. And she was a willing and active participant in taking images, whether they be video or photograph of Hitler around children, cultivating this image of Hitler as a family man, and selling those images. And she made a lot of money doing so, but in that way still feeding the propaganda machine of this particular image of Hitler that didn't actually reflect who he was.
Yet she never joined the Nazi Party.
And never joined the Nazi Party.
Let's get back to the movie, shall we?
We're talking about the movie, right?
We are. We are.
And apparently she liked to party.
Yeah, I think that comes across pretty clear. That comes across pretty clear. Well, does the madness and the chaos of the downfall of the Third Reich come across in this movie? And I think we can all answer this, and we'll just go around the table. And Rob, I'll start with you because you're sitting next to me. What do you think, Rob?
Sure, the bunker, just sort of using that as the shorthand. The bunker was the classic behavioral sink. You know, you put too many people together in a small room and there's not enough ventilation and there's too much to drink and standards of behavior. Probably people are pairing off and they're probably getting in arguments over the stupidest stuff and they're eating a monotonous diet and there's no sunlight and the war's being lost and hundreds of thousands of people are being killed and you're hearing Russian artillery shells. Like that's the sort of backdrop of everything that's happening all day. I thought that was portrayed beautifully. There's been other films, Last 10 Days of Hitler and other films that have attempted to do this, but I don't think any movie quite achieved it the way this did. There's one point where Troutl just can't handle it anymore. She's
gets up and bolts.
She's bolts. She's had probably too much to drink. It's all overwhelming, which it's like a bad dream. But you wake up from a bad dream, and this one you wake up and you're still in the same bad dream, and it seems like you're going through it over and over again. So yeah, give this movie a cred for that kind of apocalyptic age of madness thing. The bunker will always represent that to those of us who've kind of been reading about it our whole lives. Just a moment of human madness.
But you, Kaylee, what do you think?
I agree. And going outside the bunker, just the chaos in Berlin. I mean, we see the scene where Dr. Schenke is in the hospital and they're just dumping paperwork out the windows. They're burning stuff. They're, it's utter chaos everywhere in the city. And the chaos of, which is it Weidling the general? He's brought in because he's accused of moving his headquarters.
Which he didn't.
Which he hadn't. And you just see this, it's not just the chaos in the bunker. It is an utter breakdown of any control, any sense of order. And I think they do a good job of showing that inside and out.
Like Weidling shows up and says, I'm here. Why am I going to be shot? What am I being shot for?
Yeah.
He's accepted his fate. He's not the first general to be shot. And he knows. And
he's not the last either.
And he's not the last. He knows he's about to be shot. I'll just interject real quickly before we go around that he has a lot of time to think about what happened. Weidling does. He's in Soviet prison until 55, 56. I don't remember what it is. Writes a big, fulsome 3-part article. It's almost a short monograph, nearly, I suppose, 100 pages altogether, about that whole event and about the last days in Berlin, in the bunker, outside the bunker, in the streets, about how difficult it was to get to one neighborhood to the other. Weidling, to me, I don't use hero for any of these people. But Weidling's an interesting character who wrote, I think, a less well-known memoir of this period.
Yeah. And at one point, they're even showing them operating in a train car in the underground. I don't know if you really catch that when they're escaping at the end. They're operating on people underground and like a rail car.
That was Schenk, and I can't remember the other doctor's name. The one he actually had tuberculosis, and he dies in 1945 right after the Soviets capture him. I can't remember his name though. But they performed over 350 operations, I think, in less than 6 or 7 days.
And after the war, they could find no survivors of those operations. I read that somewhere.
Successful.
Go figure.
I think the movie does indeed show, I agree with everybody here, that it does show the madness and the chaos of the downfall of the Reich. The one scene that sticks into my head is the party where they go to find Fegelein. And it's about 3/4 of the way through the movie, and I mean, he is just blasted out of his mind. And I mean, he's another character. We could talk about just about any of the characters in this movie for about an hour, and he would be one of them. The actual person, not the character, but Thomas Kretschmann's character. But I mean, it's like an orgy. It's like something out of Dante.
I don't think it's like an orgy.
Well, yeah, probably, yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right. But I mean, there's just all these people in my opinion, have come to the conclusion that they're going to croak, and either the Russians are going to get them or they're going to take their own lives. So they are living it up to the last very minute. And I mean, it was just absolute chaos everywhere you went. I mean, you couldn't walk out of a building without getting shot at. You couldn't. Hell, you couldn't even trust your own citizenry. There's that one scene where Ernst Gunther Schenk is trying to make his way after going to, I think he's either going to get medicine or he's already got it, and he's trying to get back to the bunker. I forget how. But he runs across an execution squad, and they're getting ready to shoot to Volkssturm for, quote, deserting or whatever, whatever they, who knows. And that, I mean, to me, that's the ultimate symbol of absolute chaos, when you have your own military executing your own citizenry for probably nothing, frankly, for probably nothing. And there's a shot of the fat guy marching the father off into the shell of an apartment with a rope around his shoulder. Well, I mean, you know what's going to happen there. And I mean, it's just constant. When he's screaming, "We must have order! We must have order!" the whole time. So it's an absolute zoo in there the entire time, and it gets worse as it goes on.
The thing that sticks out to me is towards the beginning of the film when the father goes up to his child, I think Peter, the kid,
he's
Peter.
A fictional character, but
but representative of plenty of children who were forced to fight. But in the case of Peter, he was adamant about fighting, and his father is yelling at him and all the other kids. I mean, they're kids. What are you doing out here? This is foolish. You are going to die. And I thought that was incredibly horrifying and poignant at the same time, and yet it does represent the fanaticism that Callie talked about at the beginning. Just the sheer devotion that even children had to this lost cause.
So these people were brainwashed from the get-go. I mean, talking about the HJ and the BDM, I mean, these are kids who were, I mean, one of them is 12. How long was the Third Reich? It's 12 years. So he had known nothing but. So the fact that he, was so fanatical to the movement was something because he'd been raised into that. I'm not making any excuses again, but I mean, you can understand why some of these kids were just so warped to this. And the scene, I know exactly what you're talking about, but the scene that stands out to me specifically is where the young girl with the braids and the very young boy in the Luftwaffe uniform, he's the flak crew, and they shoot one another.
Yeah.
Well, he shoots her, and then he turns the pistol on himself. And I mean, they're in it from the get go, and they're not leaving no matter what.
Quite literally in a street battle of this sort, blocks change hands.
Many times.
So the Soviets overrun a block, and you're quickly taking down all your swastika flags and bringing out your Communist Manifesto or whatever you're trying to do. And then SS counterattacks and takes the block back, and then you're hanging the picture of the Fuhrer back over the mantelpiece. And the failure to do that quickly enough, or being caught sort of on the wrong side of the lines, metaphorically speaking, it was a matter of life and death at the end. And there really were, roaming bands of SS hanging people for a whole, for hanging out a white flag or appearing to surrender, or some old guy walking through the streets. Why aren't you with your Volkssturm unit? You mentioned Volkssturm. That's these old men and boys who were called up and given a rudimentary training and a single-shot anti-tank weapon, a Panzerfaust. That's it. So what are you doing? Why are you out of uniform? That means you're not with your Volkssturm unit. Are you a deserter? And things could spiral down very, very quickly from there. So we saw a couple victims hanging from lampposts with various placards. He negotiated with the Bolsheviks. He abandoned his people.
I supported the Red Beasts.
I supported I supported the Red Beast. Sure. Then there's the Black Beasts of the SS who may take over the block the next minute. So it goes back and forth. But since we're talking about whether we think that was an accurate portrayal, I'll just register my vote. I thought that was pretty well done.
Oh, heck yeah. I mean, that was 100% accurate. I mean, that, like you said, Rob, urban combat is the most confusing combat that you could ever possibly have. Because, I mean, not only do blocks change hands, buildings change hands. Sometimes there's
floors.
Floors. The SS are on the second floor, and the Russians are on the first floor, and it's back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I mean, sometimes the guys are holed up in the basement. I mean, it goes on and on and on. But yeah, I mean, it's mass confusion. And I think the movie did a very, 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 very good job of portraying that over and over again. As this is a German film, do you feel that there is an implicit bias within the film? And I'm throwing this out to anybody who wants to say it. Answer it.
Well, we're all staring at one another.
Yeah, somebody take it.
I mean, I think they've been accused. There was some, when the movie came out, I've read that there were some accusations that it portrayed the Germans as victims to a too large of a degree. And there were people that were unhappy by this seeming victimization of the German population. And I don't know that, I mean, they did become victims of themselves. I mean, in a way, they were. They became victims of what they bought into. I don't think that it's sympathetic towards them.
I don't either. I think it's sympathetic towards the children, as it should be, because they had no choice.
I didn't see this as being sympathetic at all. Generals are constantly coming to Hitler and saying the Ninth Army's about to be surrounded, it has to retreat. The 12th Army is about to be surrounded, it has to retreat. Steiner is not strong enough to attack, so he's had to call off the attack. And Hitler's screaming insane orders and pushing around random divisions on a map that don't really exist. I mean, we know these things are well attested to. I can't imagine that every time you make a movie that takes place in Germany, you're going to see people killed. If you make a movie, The Bunker, you're going to see Germans being killed. I saw no sympathy at all. I mean, I had the same sympathy for Hitler that I'd have for a rabid dog. You had to be put down. You have to put down a rabid dog. Hitler had to be put down for the good of humanity. I don't have any problem saying that. So I didn't get sympathy. Yeah, some of the little kid scenes, little Peter, his dad's trying to save him from an almost certain fate of death at the hand. I mean, he's lucky to be alive. If you think about it, he scrambles up in front of a bunch of Soviet infantrymen and tanks and somehow manages to scurry away. Lucky to be alive. Yeah, some sympathy for the children, but no sympathy for the devil.
But I personally, I didn't really get a bias. I mean, as we said, it's pretty accurate. And I think had that bias been there, we would have seen that in the way they're portrayed him. It's one of the most realistic portrayals of Hitler. So if they're trying to have some bias and making it seem like it wasn't so bad, they definitely, that's not there.
No, it's pretty damn bad.
Yeah. It is.
He's dictating his last will and testament, He just can't, and he goes right back there. Jewish Bolshevism. At least it portrayed Hitler as he really was, I thought.
So I will say that the thing that stood out to me watching this was, granted, I don't have a German perspective, so it's hard to know what the director and many of the cast thought or felt about this film outside of what you read in interviews. But the thing that stood out to me as contributing to arguments of these quote-unquote sympathetic Nazis is a lack of broader context outside of the scenes depicted in the film. So, for example, in the case of Schenk, right? He's almost a heroic type figure in this film as he's presented. He is concerned about the civilians of Berlin. Are they going to be able to get food? Are they going to be able to get access to medicine? He risks his life to run into a hospital to obtain said medicines. You don't get a bigger picture of who this guy is outside of that. He is concerned, as a doctor is concerned, for the well-being of the people around him, and yet we don't hear at all about the testing that went on the people at the concentration camps. He developed certain kinds of medicines and foods that were supposed to help the Nazis and to make sure that they wouldn't hurt the Nazis. They tested them out on people in concentration camps. You don't get that story at all, or just the fact that he's a member of the SS. And
criminal organization.
Yeah, and it's just, it's mentioned at the beginning and then passed on, and he almost comes out of the film as this benevolent, nearly heroic figure in the way it's depicted, and that didn't fully sit well with me.
It's a good point, Dr. B. I think you need to do a little extra reading. Well, not you. I think the one needs to do a little extra reading on that scene because there's a lot more behind that story.
And he's not the only one. The medical officer who pulls the hand grenades and kills his whole family, that guy was evil to the core. He's the one that runs the program to euthanize children. And they do almost make him seem like the sympathetic character. He goes to Hitler, "Oh, can I leave, please, my family?" And Hitler won't let him, so he goes home and kills his whole family. And you can almost feel sorry for that individual until you go and you read about what he did, and you're like, yeah, he was awful.
Oh, yeah.
Really awful.
Yeah.
But, it comes down to it. The argument about Hitler being humanized here has to do with about a about a 5-minute scene at the beginning of the movie in 1942 when he meets Troutl, and he's kind of nice to her, and he likes his dog, you know.
Right.
I mean, there's all kinds of gangster movies where, you know, the Godfather loves his cat. So, I mean, that doesn't really equate to me to humanizing anybody. So I didn't really get a sense of bias there, but I do think there are more than those two characters. Well, if I may, Albert Speer. I mean, I think Speer deserves, you know, a lot more condemnation. He's an upright figure. He's sort of like meant to be, I think, the kind of, I don't know, not loyal opposition so much, but the sane one in the bunker. Voice of reason. Voice of reason.
Voice of reason.
There's a lot of, we think Speer is the voice of reason because there's a very, very good book on this period that happened to be written by Albert Speer himself called Inside the Third Reich. And all these quotes about Hitler saying, well, if the German people are too weak, they deserve to perish, or you know, and it's going to be scorched earth. We're not going to let a thing left for the Russians. And Speer saying, Mein Führer, I've been disobeying your orders all these months. And yeah, that may be true, and it may not be true. A lot of people have called it into question, and when you come down to it, we have one source for it, and that's Speer's own memoirs. He outlived them all. He did 20 years in Spandau, got out and wrote an extremely successful memoir, again, Inside the Third Reich. So, yeah, he appears to be a pretty normal guy here in this movie too, but Speer was condemned for the gigantic, the monstrous use of slave labor in the course of World War II. Human skeletons chained to their drill presses, banging out parts for airplanes till they dropped in underground caverns. He's a thoroughly evil guy. Very artful writer. He said, Hitler bewitched me. Like, it was like reading Faust, and it was like the devil and his blue eyes, and I couldn't disobey anything he told me to do. But, you know, that didn't really fly at Nuremberg. And frankly, I just don't think it should fly for anybody. So we've mentioned a few of these characters now, but I didn't want this podcast to go by without having a say about Albert Speer.
And I don't think it was something that the filmmakers did intentionally. I think it's just kind of the constraints of making a film. You can't give 12 years of background on these individuals, so it's kind of up to the viewer to figure out who these people are and do your own research. Look up this guy. Okay, who was this guy that he knew if his children fell to the Russians, it would be bad? Why did he feel like he had to kill his family? So I don't think it was an intentional move on the filmmaker's part to make you feel sympathy towards these individuals, but it's dangerous because it can happen.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of assumption on the part of the audience that they will do that extra research or that they just know who these people are. And outside of Hitler or Eva Braun, they're not always the most. Of course, you have Himmler and Goebbels and Goering in there. Yeah. I mean, there are recognizable individuals popping up, but not everybody knows Schenck. So this is something that I think well-placed lines of dialogue can bring in important context, and that was unfortunately lacking.
I think you also have to remember the original intended audience for this movie too. There were Germans.
Yeah,
and they know a hell of a lot more about Albert Speer than do most high schoolers in the United States. Yeah. So with that being said, and I would highly advise anyone who does watch this movie to do your own research and find out, because some of these guys they have fascinating careers, utterly evil. But I mean, the way they did things and the way they came about to do things is bizarre, and it's interesting to read how they got to where they were. Albert Speer being one of them.
But the number of them who wrote their memoirs or kept their own diaries, it's out there. If you want to read their own words and then maybe read what other people have sort of analyzed their own words, and I'll just say this because it's what I've done for a living. You want to read about the Third Reich? Want to read about the last month of the Third Reich? You can do it for the rest of your life. Hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of books.
And I'll just say this about Albert Speer. When he tells the Fuhrer that he's been disobeying his orders, and Rob, you and I had this conversation before this recording, and I'll just repeat it now. I don't buy that for 1 minute. You know, there are people, there are generals, there are, combat veteran generals, Knight's Cross recipients who are being dragged out into the street and shot. And here you are, you don't do anything militarily. You're not any kind of field commander. You have no value to the situation at all, other than just appearing and disappearing. And how the hell does he get in and out of there so goddamn often, by the way? But appearing and disappearing, and then you have the stones to tell Adolf Hitler that, oh yeah, by the way, I've been ignoring you for the last 6 to 8 months. I don't buy that for a second.
Yeah, the movie parses it in this way, that Hitler sees Speer as the artist that he never became, a young man with architectural talents. As we all know,
which he did.
Hitler wanted to be an artist, then he wanted to be an architect. And if you look carefully in that scene, there's a tear coming on it, tear trickling down the Fuhrer's cheek as as Speer tells him. I don't know. There's a lot of testimony about how obsequious Speer was in the presence of the Fuhrer as well. So that it does seem a little bit much that it finally, after knowing about the Jews being killed in Auschwitz, which Speer almost certainly did. He was at Himmler's famous speech in Posen in 1943, where they discussed it openly, working hundreds of thousands of unfortunate victims to death in underground chambers. All those things are fine. He did anything Hitler told him to do, but then at the end, he disobeys Hitler and has the guts to go in and tell him. Once again, we'll just say this, the testimony for it, the evidence for it, is from a single book, which happened to be written by Speer himself. So we'll just say that.
You could throw it out the other side. Is it guts, or is it kind of he knows he's down and he's kicking a man while he's down? It's kind of a final thrust of, you thought you've been so powerful all these years. Guess what? I mean, it's...
I don't buy it. I don't think he ever said it. I really don't. I don't think he ever said it. I don't think anybody's going to have the guts to say that to that lunatic at that moment in time when he knows, he can hear the friggin' gunshots outside, that he knows that people are being dropped like sacks of dirt, that he's going to walk in there and say, hey, look here, Chief, I ain't been listening to you. Peace, I'm out. I'm going back to Hamburg. No, doesn't fly. I don't think he ever said it.
It's intriguing, though. It's intriguing that if Speer is the ultimate opportunist, Kaylee, then he's just reading another opportunity. Well, Hitler's obviously lost control of the situation. Maybe this is the time I can break with him and then go to the Allies and say, hey, I saved Germany from being destroyed at the end of the war, which is exactly what he did. It worked out pretty well for him. He only got 20 instead of life or execution, or the noose.
Noose, yeah.
And I also read that he alleged afterwards that he had been plotting to assassinate Hitler by gassing the bunker. Easy to say after the war. I do think
he bought the gas.
Yeah.
It's almost like he was poised over the air intake.
Over the vents, yeah.
And let's just say, where does that story come from? Inside the Third Reich by Albert Speer.
That's interesting.
I bet you're going to have me back again to this podcast. Because the one lesson I have is read Inside the Third Reich. So many of the stories in so much of this movie is from that book.
So there's one thing that struck me as, and I want to pose this question to you all, Seth. I'm so sorry for stepping on your toes, but this question about German perspective, or the perspective of the movie, I can't help but wonder if it would be a different film today, if it was made today with the increasing rise of nationalism globally. This was made in the early 2000s, which, looking back, global politics were in a very different place, especially in Europe. And I couldn't help but wonder how a German filmmaker, may tell this story now.
I'll comment on that one. I don't think I don't think it would be much different. And the reason I say this is because, have you seen any of the episodes of Das Boot, the TV show?
Oh, I have not.
It's crap, number one. But number two, I mean, they bang on the Third Reich, and they're hard. Like I'm not saying that every movie maker in Germany would do exactly what they've done in that show, but I think the anti-Nazi feelings are still very strong in Germany, as they should be. I mean, I think that they're very strong, and they may even be stronger in some certain circles.
I think the main difference between 2004 and now, not to turn this into a history lecture, I think there was a resurgent right in Germany. There's a resurgent right wing. I think people recognize the dangers of resurgent right wing. So there could be, I don't know, Seth or Kristen, maybe more specific call-outs to the contemporary era, which I think this movie pretty much avoided. It played it straight as a history lesson, and again, took so many of these very familiar lines and very familiar episodes and put them together into a narrative. But that could be one way it's different. People bang hard on the Third Reich today, Seth, in unified Germany. But again, there's anti-immigrant sentiment. There's right-wing resurgence in many areas since reunification. The old East Germany never really felt integrated into the new combined Germany, and there's still serious problems there. So it's always an intriguing question. A historical movie is about history, so it's about 45, but it's also about the time in which it was made. So the movie can't help but be about 2004. And maybe, there'd be certain tweaks in it. Maybe there'd be more about Schenk's real activities when he was outside the bunker.
Yeah, right.
Who knows?
I don't know.
It was just something that popped into my mind as I was watching it. I couldn't help but wonder.
Well, the film is based on a couple of books, and we mentioned one of them already, Speer's book, and actually the book based on three books, I think, Joachim Fest's book and Traudl Junge's book, Until the Final Hour, which came out, I think, right after the movie did, and she died right before the movie premiered. She died in 2002, and the movie premiered in 2004. But Has anybody here read that book?
I have.
As have I. Do you think that the memoir or parts of it come across? Because she's kind of she's the co-star, if you will, because you see a lot of
She's
her.
the protagonist. She doesn't appear to be evil in any way, shape, or form.
She doesn't say a whole heck of a lot.
No.
She just acts with her face, more often than not, and I think she did a pretty good job of it, frankly. But do you think her story is represented well here? You think it comes across pretty good?
I do. I mean, she is not a central character in this whole in the reality. In 1945, she is
Bit player.
a bit player,
Yeah,
and I think they did a very good job of weaving her story in so that if you're familiar with it, you don't feel like she's missing. But I think it was well balanced, and she starts and ends the film as well. So I think that.
What about, if I can take over the role of questioner for a moment, Seth? This
Go
is
for
fun. What about the bookends where you see actual Traudl Junge? I have a serious question about whether that was necessary. I know why it was included, just so the filmmakers could diffuse these kinds of questions we're talking about as to whether this was some kind of, whether it's dangerous to humanize these people, whether this is some kind of whitewash or done from the Nazi perspective. And you see this woman confessional saying, well, I kind of realized when I saw this happening, I didn't realize at the time, I wonder who that child was, talking about herself. Then she comes back at the end. I don't know. I always find those bookends kind of artificial. I think there were almost an insurance policy here in this case rather than necessary to the film.
It's quite possible. I've watched a documentary with her, which is called Blind Spot, where it's basically her just sitting there giving her oral history, and it's very, very, very interesting. But my point in all this is that she comes across as very, very innocent. She knew nothing about this. Now, she was a secretary, and again, Rob, we had this conversation previously, but
We talk all the time, apparently, Seth.
what was it that she saw, or what was it that she typed? I find it very hard to believe that this woman who was his direct secretary, him being, of course, Hitler, his direct secretary for 3 years, that she knew nothing about the crimes that Nazi Germany committed. I find that very, very difficult to believe. And with that, I'll open it up for debate here, but, she's painted as this innocent figure, and she very well may have been. But again, I find it very hard to believe that she didn't know what the hell was going on in that country when she is literally tied to the hip to the man who makes all the decisions. She's with the boss. What do you guys think?
I mean, she tries to explain it as they lived in this bubble, and her
Nazi
book,
bubble, by the way.
Yes, a Nazi bubble. And I mean, most of the time they're at the Wolf's Lair or they're at the Berghof, and they are very isolated. She's not in Berlin going out in town and seeing the way other people are living. She sees it a little bit when she goes to Munich to visit her family, but they're in this bubble and information is filtered. And that's how she tries to explain it. Well, we weren't listening to the news. We weren't getting outside accounts. But I definitely agree. How can you be typing a man's letters and correspondence and things that would come in for him, and you have to retype them and not know? And not only that, but the laws that have been put into place. She was living in Munich and Berlin when Jews were being persecuted and Jews couldn't go to schools and they couldn't go to parks. So she knew she had to have known something was going on.
And that's my point, is that she's portrayed as this, and she wrote her own book. She is portrayed as this innocent young girl who just was completely blind to everything that was going on. I don't buy it. I really don't. I mean, did she know everything? No. But I think she knew a hell of a lot more than she let on.
So I'll say the way the movie portrays her, it's almost as like the quote unquote like moral compass-ish, where when you have these moments where Hitler is spewing off anti-Semitic views, his gloating over how he was able to erase Jewish presence from Europe, et cetera, she gives these little faces and stuff. You mentioned that, how she acts with her face a lot.
Yep.
And that makes sense as a secretary. Secretaries aren't there to include their thoughts or inject their beliefs into a discussion. But nonetheless, I feel like those moments in which he says something anti-Semitic, and it cuts to her and she does this like face, like kind of like, well, that's not okay.
Yeah.
There's just like this weird reminder to the audience that that's actually bad. And also absolving her in this simultaneous moment.
Right.
And I think those bookends do that as well. It's this weird kind of distance of accountability in her own words, and then also reinforced through the portrayal in the film itself.
So count me a non-fan of the bookends. I just don't think, I didn't think that worked. It didn't work for me. It was so obvious why the filmmakers were doing it. But the one place where he says Jewish Bolshevism or something, and she makes a face. There's the big scene is when she's typing up his last will and testament, and the implication is she's never heard him say anything like this before.
That's what I'm saying.
But
I mean,
I'm sure she's heard him say something like that before. And she says, is it to Ava Brown? She says, he's sometimes so nice, and then he says these horrible things.
Yeah.
And Ava says, well, that's when he's being the Fuhrer. That it's from her book. So once again, it's an accurate reflection of the book.
Sure.
Whether Traudl Junge is telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in her own memoirs. I also, since I seem to be hammering on people for their memoirs, and someday I intend to write my own. All memoirs are self-justification. It's why people write memoirs.
Yeah.
So, tell me a memoir that really nails, when the person really nails him or herself. By and large, that's just not why you write memoirs. So when we say Traudl Junge or Albert Speer's memoirs are kind of a self-justification, let's just remember that's exactly what they're meant to be. Again, I think the filmmakers are trying to make a movie about what happened in the bunker, and occasionally the characters come up out of the bunker and walk around the bunker, and then the shells begin and they go back down into the bunker. I think having said all that, they used some historical sources. They attempted to remain as true as they could to the historical sources. There's times when we're being critical of it, and I think the movie does invite you to be critical of it. I would hope that anyone would watch that movie, and when Traudl Junge says, well, now that I know better, I'm really sorry for what I did, you say, well, that's easy to say. That's easy for everybody to say after you've committed a crime. I used to say to my parents, I'm sorry. And they would say, are you sorry, or are you sorry you got caught? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, that's an obvious question that I think we'd want to ask some of the characters in Downfall.
Especially when she compares herself to, she compares, the year she started working for Adolf Hitler for the same year that Sophie Scholl was executed.
That was it. That was it.
I was like, come on, please. Don't even go there.
And she was my age and was the same age.
Yeah, blah, blah. But, I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. Her book is fascinating, by the way. Mm-hmm. It is a fascinating book. Whether it's, as you say, Rob, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, I don't know. But it's a good read either way.
So Joachim Fest's book, Hitler, is, also just as long as we're on the subject of books, it's well worth reading. First biography I ever read of Adolf Hitler. Fest is a really erudite guy, a German. He was the editor for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. So it was like, being the editor of the New York Times, one of the newspapers of record in West Germany at the time. And, he did tons of research, and the book really does hew very faithfully to Fest's overall look at what happened in the bunker in those last 10 days. So much so that, if you've read Fest, you said, and now there's going to be the big party scene, and now there's going to be the scene where somebody shoots himself. And, once again, I think the filmmakers are trying to do is remain faithful to the sources that they chose to base this on. At the very least, I don't find them making stuff up out of the whole cloth that they don't have some kind of source for.
Yep. No, I don't. I mean, there's a few things in there that, are flip-flopped. Like when Magda Goebbels is narrating the letter to her son Harold. If you read the actual letter, there's some things in there where she says it in the movie. It's out of order than the actual letter. Kaylee and I, we were having this conversation before, so I don't just talk to you, Rob.
Good to know, Seth.
But there's some of those things that are out of context, and why they did that in the movie, I frankly don't know. Because if you read her letter, it's both disgusting and chilling all at the same. It's like GIF.
Can we talk about Magda some more? Kayla, you said at the beginning that you think there were some things about the way that was treated that.
Well, as far as accuracy,
that's what I mean.
If you read different books, Traudl Junge, she claims she saw all these small coffins being carried out of the bunker, but then other accounts say the Russians found all the children in the bunker. It's just little things of people's perspectives of how things happen, and that's when you're relying on people's memories. That's going to happen. And then the manner in which the whole thing went down is, there's different versions of it. The film portrays, she gives them this sip of
like
something, it'll help you sleep.
Portion, yeah.
There's versions that the children were given morphine injections. They were given chocolates that had a sleeping potion in them. And so the ways in which it happened. And one thing that's interesting I've read is that in the film, they show Joseph as kind of hanging around outside, letting Magda just take care of this whole
Kill
thing.
her children. Yeah.
Some accounts,
there's a doctor involved too. Helps them
figure it out.
and even which doctor that is up for debate, depending on who you read. And another account says that Joseph happened to leave for an hour, and he's not even in the bunker when this happens. And he comes back and finds her sitting there in his office by herself. So there's a lot of different...
Playing cards.
Yes, playing cards. So there's a lot of different versions of the story, but to me, none of that really matters.
But flat
because
out
she did
crazy.
it.
Flat out crazy.
Yeah.
Magda Goebbels.
Absolutely.
And end result's ultimately the
Yeah,
same.
exactly.
I know the fine details are important, but I will say that scene was chilling.
I can't watch it.
When the child is resisting drinking the solution, I had to hit pause. I had to take a break.
Yeah.
That was
And they've
too
been
much.
talking about this since January. They had been planning this for months as things started to go down. You can read as early as January of 45. They realized things ain't going so great and what's going to happen to us.
When you say planning it since January, it really does kind of bring the movie into focus for me. There's a lot of argument amongst historians, German historians today, that what Hitler was doing at the end of the bunker was staging his own downfall. That is like a playwright. So he could have escaped, like a fugitive, and
multiple opportunities.
and run out of Berlin. But instead, he decided to stay. There were his faithful minions in the bunker, the last stand against the Bolsheviks storming Berlin. And so, this puts Hitler in the category of kind of a consummate actor, and he does it because he thinks that if he stages a glorious and dramatic downfall, future generations may someday return to him and look back at this
be a
moment
martyr.
as his great moment of martyrdom, which, I don't know. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's an interesting way of looking at this, and it helps us answer some questions that otherwise are inexplicable. Like, why wouldn't Hitler get the heck out of Dodge?
Rob, to that point, I wonder sometimes if at the end when you see Hitler has these moments where he's all pathetic and, oh, it's a loss and I'm just going to have to take my life. I think he was either an emotionally manipulative person, and I think he knew what he was doing. And to your point, acting, he knew that Ava would feel sorry for him. Oh, everyone's leaving me. They're leaving you if you're, I think whether he was acting or he was an emotionally manipulative person and he was just using that to toy with everyone around him to get what he wanted is a really interesting to think about, because I think Ava was the same. She can attempt suicide twice because he's not giving her enough attention. And it's kind of adds to this sense of these really just messed up individuals that have some deep-seated problems.
And I'll say it also calls to mind Speer's line in the movie of "You should be on the stage when the curtain falls."
They even call that one out directly, right? You should be on the stage when the curtain falls, right?
Well, thanks for stealing my last closing line, guys. Jeez.
Well, Seth, this is got to bring your A game when you have us in your
Well, I
studio.
had it. Anyway. Well, let's wrap this podcast up. We've been talking for a while. Kristen, I'll start with you. Did you like it, and would you recommend the movie?
I think it's a very interesting film, and I think it does have some amazing portrayals of very infamous people, and presents an interesting perspective. I know we mentioned it at the beginning, and I think I'll bring it back around to the fact that this film is known for one very famous scene, the quote-unquote downfall scene in which Hitler realizes that it's all over, which the scene that launched 1,000 memes, if we will, and just the extent of how much this movie has been tied to kind of this memification. Bruno Gantz's obit, I found online one of his obituaries, because he died in February of this year. It lists Bruno Gantz, whose Hitler scene from Downfall took over YouTube, dies at 77. Oh, poor guy. But nonetheless, I thought it was a really interesting spin on this film. It's the only thing I knew about this film until I watched it. But I will just say this. Memes are fascinating things. We think of them, I think, as very, passing. They're almost like the ephemera of the 21st century. But they are these points of connection. They are cultural snapshots, images or scenes in which people can share and have those images or scenes speak for them. And I find it very interesting that scene in which Hitler is losing his mind has come to speak for so many people in so many different contexts, because Hitler is speaking for the person who's sharing that meme. And in a weird way, for someone who launches his political career as speaking for the quote-unquote everyman of Germany. Fast forward to the 21st century, and he is speaking for the everyman of, Xbox world. If someone's upset about the new Xbox, someone upset about, political happenstances. I know there's ones about the Clintons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You name it. There were hundreds of these things made, and in this weird way, this one scene has come to speak. Hitler, by proxy, is speaking for people again, and I found that very intriguing, and I know that is a wayward answer to your question, but I felt like we would be remiss if we didn't at least discuss it a little further. That being said, I would recommend it with further research.
Kaylee?
I do like it, and I would recommend it. I think it's, as we said, it's one of the better portrayals of not just Hitler, but Germany under the Third Reich, and definitely the best portrayal of the collapse of that Reich.
Yeah, I'll just finish up. I'll reiterate what my friend said here today. I thought it was a great movie. It was over long. At about the 2-hour mark, I said, well, there was no suspense. It's not like Hitler's going to rally at the end and come up with some stratagem to ward off the Russians from.
How it ends.
Yeah, we know how it ends from the beginning. Having said that, I think I think it is based pretty deeply on some historical sources. Is it a perfect piece of history? No. If you want a perfect piece of history, you got to go write one or go read one. Hollywood. That's not why Hollywood. This isn't Hollywood, but that's not why films are made. But the film has become immortal, as Kristen just said, through memes. Hitler finds out that Michigan has lost to Ohio State yet again. Hitler finds out that he's a meme.
Yeah, that's my favorite one.
In which Hitler says, he's screaming in the subtitles, say, I conquered all of Europe and now I'm a meme.
Yep.
So it's somehow hit a chord with popular culture. I'll defer to my colleague Kristen. That was some good analysis. I think that Hitler, the man of the people, still in some way speaking in an ever more deranged way for perhaps an ever more deranged world. I don't know, but sure, absolutely worth watching. I think the criticisms about humanizing Hitler, I think those are overdone. I think people say that before they've seen the film.
I would agree with that. I don't think, again, as we've said numerous times throughout this podcast, he was a human being. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure he wasn't a ranting, raving lunatic 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for his 56 years of life. I sincerely doubt that he was screaming at the top of his lungs when he ordered his breakfast. I'm sure there were moments where he was just a regular guy, granted, ultimately a deranged regular guy, but
got to be careful about this.
Yeah, strike that. But no, in all seriousness, he was a human being, but he was I think he was portrayed very accurately in this movie. I did like the movie. I agree with you, Rob. Being 2 hours and 20 minutes long with some of the other movies we've done on this podcast, it's really not that long, but damn, did it seem longer than that.
I think, doesn't he kill himself an hour into the film?
Yeah,
so there's an hour and a half of film with Hitler dead.
Yeah. It is, I watched it basically over a period of an entire day. I had to pause and get up and do something else, and then come back and all right, let me watch it again. And watch it, good Lord, all right, I got to get up and go do something else. And, let me go outside for a little while. It's, God dang, there's still an hour left of this movie.
Remember, it's downfall. So maybe it's not downfall, Kelly, of Hitler, but downfall of the Reich.
Well, absolutely.
And so there are still a few days left at the end, but it's tough watching. I agree.
And that's to say, the star of the film isn't necessarily Hitler. It is the Third Reich.
Yeah.
It's everyone's story.
Yeah, well, to a point. But I would recommend it. I think it's fairly accurate. It's got some flubs here and there, but by and large, it's a pretty good flick. Rob, you got final thoughts?
I'll just say that I think people should watch this film, but watch it with caution.
Kelly?
Definitely watch the film, and as we've said, do some research. Learn about who these individuals are before you make any assumptions or jump to any conclusions about them.
That is exactly what I was going to say. It's one to watch with further research.
Yep, agreed. Very good movie. You need to check it out, but do some reading after the fact. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, tune into our mini episode next week. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes and Stitcher if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.